today's World Insight, a yearly reckoning of China's economy at the crucial Central Economic Work Conference. What's at stake? And the quick rollout of COVID vaccines underway. How safe and effective? Direct answer from the chief of the International Vaccine Institute.
There is a requirement that vaccines be safe and effective.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Chinese planners are set to sort through the country's economic performance at this year's Central Economic Work Conference to be held in Beijing later this month. The gathering charts the course for the year ahead. Discussions at this year's meeting are expected to center around China's gradual recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic goals in its latest five-year plan. China's economy rebounded quickly during the second and third quarters as the pandemic had been largely under control. So what could be the meeting's top agenda and any big changes next year? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on the Central Economic Work Conference, joining us in Washington, D.C., William Li, Chief Economist of the Milken Institute. In Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Professor Liu, as you may know, the conference, Central Working Conference, is the one that of the highest level policymakers in China trying to figure out what's going to be the plan for 2021. It's not just a five-year plan. It's more specific than five-year plan. It's about at the end of the year, you set a blueprint, given the circumstances, to think about next year. We have seen, Professor Liu, very much a concentration about China trying to deal with its own issues and challenges within its own border and use reform as an innovation as the driving force. Earlier we heard a lot about reform and opening up. Opening up has been committed earlier, of course, through China's new five-year plan, but the coming year, 2021, has been very much two keywords, reform and innovation. So how do you see this shift of focus, at least for 2021, Professor?
I would really see this is really a plan B because China's the interdependence with the rest of the world is still very high. And now seeing the situation that China is constantly being blocked of the access for high tech, and also when the rest of the world, particularly the United States, is still keeping the high level tariff. So therefore, this is something that China can really survive and also prosper if we focus more on internal circulation. But I would say because the central government is still pushing forward for the further opening store, so therefore the message has been blurred and ambiguous. But over the recent several moves, like the Import-Expo in Shanghai and also the Xi Jinping speech in Shenzhen, it seems that he's really clarifying some of the clouds over the sort of dual circulation, because China is still resolved to keep its open door and also the open further of its market access to the rest of the world for both investment and trade.
Well, of course, I got it. I mean, reform and opening up still very important for China, but we do need to take a look at the closest, at the latest, rather, emphasis that's been put into China's plan for the year 2021. Mr. Li, how do you see that? I mean, at a time the global economy is still going to be impacted by the pandemic, we latest they have been hearing the U.S. is likely to have a few million vaccination by the end of this year, probably by the middle of next year. That's according to the plan, of course, if the plan can be implemented. Anyone who wants to have a vaccine can have access to a vaccine, which means the U.S. economy might not be able to up and function with its full steam, at least not before the middle of next year. So what would that mean for China, when it's focusing on reform and innovation rather than reform and opening up.
Yes, I absolutely agree that the United States and the rest of the Western world will not be back in full force again until probably, in my guess, the end of next year, when people are able to go about freely as they did before the pandemic. And I think you're absolutely right to be concerned that how will China be able to boost its own economy, be able to sustain the recovery that is underway so far? Because right now, China's manufacturing has been the basis of China's growth, and a lot of supply side has increased, but the demand side is not. So we see inventories building up, and we see imbalances starting to develop within the Chinese economy. And I think one of the things that Professor Liu mentioned was innovation, and I think that's really the key. But innovation is one of these things where you can't force. Well, what made Shenzhen so successful and Hong Kong so successful was the notion that experimentation was allowed and people were allowed to fail, and they would sort of grope their way, as Deng Xiaoping said, you cross the river by touching the stones, and if you fall in, you get wet, and then you pick yourself up and keep going. But when you direct innovation toward the needs of the center, that is almost going too far. And many central planned economies, whether it's Japan back in the 80s or even Singapore, where they try to direct investment and innovation, that has more often failed than not. So I would think that China's strategy going forward, the immediate need is to make sure that domestic demand is boosted, and boosted in the households by ensuring that their income growth is sufficient, and by cutting back on the debt increases that have gone on in the corporate sector and government sector, which has brought a lot of concern for international investors, and then able to focus its policy growth priorities domestically first, and then by importing more, be a locomotive of growth for the rest of the world.
Got your point. Everybody wants China to import more, and China probably is doing that. But let's handle some of the issues that you mentioned one by one, rather than concentrate only on one issue. That is manufacturing, you all mentioned, both of you. The other is supply chain, and of course, innovation. So let's talk specifically. Manufacturing, Professor Liu. China has, of course, graduated from the stage in which it has a huge labor surplus and therefore a huge advantage in all levels of manufacturing. Now, China focuses more on innovation and the higher level of manufacturing, but this also is an interesting time because of the pandemic. China probably is the only economy in the world so far that is still up and functioning with somewhat full steam. And some could argue even more in some sectors because the other economies will not be able to work as much as they want to. Therefore, China manufacturing and exports actually is enjoying, quote unquote, a small period of increase despite of the general trend of this national economy. So, Professor Liu, how do you see this interesting change, even could be temporary? What does it mean for China's, future plan of manufacturing? What does it mean for China's relations with the rest of the world when it comes to surplus? And what does it mean for China's own initiative of uplifting the levels of manufacturing and linking it with innovation?
If you look at the Chinese competitiveness over the past years, it is really the demographic dividend where the migrating workers are contributing a great deal by lower salary and hard work. And also there was also a sort of environmental dividend where the environmental control was not as tough as today. So now these really two drivers are really winning, but therefore we have to shift onto a high quality growth. Right now, yes, many of the Chinese manufacturing bases are really, enjoying a sort of window opportunity when the competitors, particularly in Asia, are still locked down. But this won't really last. So we do see there is also a momentum that the reallocation of the lower-end supply chain is really has been going to Vietnam, to Myanmar, to Cambodia, etc. But right now, how we can really move to high quality growth as it is so much politically correct. So the one thing, of course, is really for innovation. We have a higher level of technology, but the key is still human capacity. Without really the uplifting the skills of those workers, without really the right type of education, you can hardly move forward, even if you have cutting technology in one area, but the general quality won't be elevated as the policymakers might have desired.
Mr. Li.
I think one thing he didn't mention was the shape of globalization has changed over the last year, and that the trade has now become much more regionalized. So China is much more of a large participant within the Pacific and ASEAN trade blocs, as the last trade pact has demonstrated. But the trouble is, China has also got to maintain its participation with the Europeans and the American trade bloc. And this regionalization of trade is something that's going to require a renegotiation of a new trade pact that recognizes the new realities of regionalization of supply chains and also the nationalization of many of the industries that are going on. And China is going to have to compete with other national champions.
During this preparation conference for the Central Work Conference, which is planning China's economic development for the next year, has been talking about how to make sure that China will endure the vulnerability of the global supply chain and make sure it will have the capability to provide a de-link if it happened in this global supply chain on its own. Mr. Li, how do you see China's role in this global supply chain and vulnerability of this global supply chain right now? And what would that mean when China's economy is planning its future?
I think China would expose itself to a huge vulnerability if in its rush to be less vulnerable or independent of foreign sources, it starts to develop innovations according to its own standards. One of the things that is characteristic of the 21st century technology is interconnectedness and networking. We need to be able to plug into anything in the world. And if China develops its own standards on 5G, GPS standards, and then other such technologies, I think China will find itself more and more isolated.
I have to point out, as liberal and as open-minded as you are, I'm not sure whether many of the policymakers in your country are exactly what you're thinking. For example, some key components of consumer-favored high-tech products in the market might not be available to Chinese companies as a result of the tech war. And also, as we are talking about the pandemic, there might be certain de-link of the global supply chain because certain economies would not be able to run as much as it would like. And therefore, you tell me, what would China do? So we just wait until it is possible? Or just stop production of those, let's just say, smartphones? Should Huawei just collapse on its own, waiting for a chip coming from the U.S.? How do you think Chinese companies would do if you were the decision maker?
Well, certainly, I think one of the things to ensure your supply of inputs that are vital for your production, and Huawei, I think, is well aware of what it needs from the West, Western producers. I think the key is whether Huawei is able to reassure the American policymakers that what it does with this input is something that is not against the interests of U.S. and global national security.
Huawei said, I open my door, you come and you can also check with me, but there has been a tag put on the hat of Huawei. Having said that, though, you talk about the standards of 5G. There are different kinds of standards as we speak being developed right now. There's a lack of cooperation, of discussion and dialogue about which standard could be the best and commonly adopted. Now, that is not a conversation that China could have on its own. China has to have others to talk together in order to have a dialogue. And now we are not seeing that. We're not seeing that at the United Nations level. They are trying to create a mechanism in which important players are coming in, but they don't have some of these players because they are refusing to come on this platform. There are other industry kinds of standard discussion, which also has been very difficult because of geopolitical war. So this has been a blocking factor for we talk about standards, and now you're saying, oh, China has to wait, and therefore we will have a standard, and then you subscribe. So what does that mean, Mr. Li?
I'm not saying China has to wait at all. In fact, China can proceed as it feels is necessary for its domestic market. China's got a huge domestic market. It could develop GPS standards and 5G standards for its own economy. But it's just like what happened with the Japanese in the war with Betamax and VHS. The market will sort out whatever standards are the most appropriate and best used in the rest of the world. And so if China cannot have an agreed upon set of standards and goes off on its own, I hope that at least they will hedge their bets and use standards that are very similar to what's used in the rest of the world.
Is it going to be a test for China, or is it going to be a test for the incoming administration in the U.S. about how much actually they can push in the directions that you just argued?
The market will be the test. Betamax was a much better technical standard, but it died because people just didn't like it, because it didn't have the recording capacity. Laser discs, we'd never see them anymore. So a lot of technologies that were really fantastic technologies just absolutely died because the markets refused to accept them. China is going to have to work its way through by, as I said, groping and experimentation, and some experimentation is going to fail. So China's going to have to adopt a very wide spectrum of possibilities to see what the global market will accept, not just the domestic market.
Across the global marketplace. But of course, I would say this is really a local action, but with global vision. Because right now, China cannot wait. We have to cater to the high-level demand in the domestic market, either for consumers and also for the connectivity of Internet of Things and also the entire logistics, and also the big data, etc. But of course, we have to leave one to plug with the rest of the world, because eventually it is not really the political considerations that is going to drive continuous innovation. It is really the global marketplace who are really paying for it, who are really supporting the improvement with the information or feedback from the consumer end.
Having said that, though, let's move on to another question, which both of you are very enthusiastic about, the keyword innovation. So now we have seen a shift from investment only, particularly about the infrastructure and others, to innovation. So how are we seeing this process going on in the Chinese economy? What are some of the most important, potentials or stages that you perceive in this process, Mr. Li?
I think China's success in innovation so far has been fantastic at the large company level and at the technological level. But the challenge for China is going to be developing its service sector innovations, innovative advances in fintech, in e-commerce, in digital currencies. These are the areas that China is going to have to develop in order to ensure efficiency within its domestic economy and boosting domestic demand. China's immediate problem is to make sure that household demand grows and is sustained while the government is able to cut back on public consumption and infrastructure spending in a way that it allows it to contain the rise in debt. So for me, I think the key to innovation now is to allow the small businesses and entrepreneurs to experiment in the service sector and develop new innovations that service a demand that's been revealed through COVID. We want more remote access to the many goods and services, not just in China, but around the world. And that's the source of innovation that China's going to have to try to promote.
Professor Liu, how do you see this innovation driving the Chinese economy, and also make sure it will not becoming a bubble, but rather it will become a possible road for the Chinese economy to really get quality growth?
Well, it seems that innovation has become a household word globally, but its application is very different. When we talked about innovation in the past, actually it was really innovative way of applying existing technologies to expand the Chinese marketplace, and also to bring better connectivity between different sectors of the industries. But now, when we talk about innovation, the application part is retreating, but the breakthrough part is now on the high agenda because we do really wanted to identify new materials, digital economy, and also the biotechnology, et cetera, et cetera. It's a more forward-looking, and now we are really standing at the forefront on a global basis, either in terms of cooperation or in terms of competition. But that's also becoming tougher because, having a breakthrough is very different to, to application. That really requires a high level of think tanks. That also requires the basic theories that can really match with the right type of quality people that surround the entire industry, instead of someone that bring a funny technology and apply to existing environment.
Having said that, though, the investors worldwide are looking at the picture in an interesting way. If I could just quote from a latest article coming from the Financial Times about the investment coming into China from international investors. China's benchmark CSI 300 index is up about 27% this year in dollar terms, beating the S&P 500 by more than 13 percentage points. Shenzhen's tech-focused Chinex has risen some 59% on the same basis, exceeding even the runaway U.S. tech benchmark, the NASDAQ Composite. Chinese government bonds have also drawn new fans with their rare source of yield. So these are just some of the phenomena we see with the incoming of foreign investors and foreign investment. So, Mr. Li, are we seeing a very interesting mixture of phenomena?
Yeah, as you know, we at Milken talk to a lot of global investors of all sizes, large institutional pension funds as well as small private equity firms. One of the common themes that is said again and again is we go to China because it's a huge marketplace. But the acid test for whether or not an investment is going to work is whether or not it creates a better quality of life for the citizens within China. And quality, not quantity, I think is the key word here, because the innovations that we're talking about that makes it easier and life better for everyone. And so the source of foreign innovation coming into China, you'll see that the U.S. firms are primarily focusing on the financial sector to improve the financial products that are offered in China relative to what we have in the rest of in the West, and also to be able to have better consumer options so that when China goes through the sort of reforms that we know it's going to do, hukou reform, allowing people to migrate to urban centers, life in the urban center can be made much better with different innovations that we are seeing on the frontier, both in fintech as well as in e-commerce. And so I think the foreign investors are chomping at the bits to be able to get qualitatively better improvements in innovation in China.
Yeah. Professor Liu, we have seen, interestingly, another phenomenon, the antitrust drive, that is anti-monopoly. Certainly that's likely to be quite an important theme for China's economic plan for the next year. Professor Liu, how do you see the anti-monopoly issue that has been discussed in China?
Well, any innovation is born monopolistic because that's the way the industries move forward. However, as they grow, they become dominant, and then they used to be the leaders, but eventually they become the blockade against the innovation across the marketplace. So therefore, that is really the rationale to bring up the antitrust review against the industry when they grow too big and when they are really getting oppressive to the marketplace and exploitive against the consumers. So right now, China is really stepping into such a stage in terms of the e-commerce, in terms of the fintech, because immediately they can gather such a large amount of capital and leverage on the people's enthusiasm, leverage on the entire financial marketplace, be it banks, be it insurance companies, etc. So that is getting more and more dangerous, at least, towards the entire marketplace for innovation, and also that when the financial market is getting more and more sensitive towards the consumption and investment, So they should be reviewed in a way that whether they are still healthy in contributing to innovation or also contributing to financial stability of the Chinese marketplace.
Mr. Li.
Within the West, a lot of the discussion about breaking up these large tech companies is based on the notion of accountability. We just want them to be accountable. I think most people recognize that there are economies of scale and scope that are never seen before in previous industries like oil and steel. In the case of internet technologies, networking is really the essence of their business. And as you get more economies of scale and scope, you get more efficient so that no consumer out there is paying more today than they did yesterday, which is the characteristic of monopolistic competition. So I think one of the things that the discussion has to focus on, both in the United States as well as in China, is how do you hold these firms accountable? How do you prevent them from censoring data and censoring news just because they don't agree with certain views? So the notion of accountability and transparency are the key questions that will be faced by policymakers in China as well as the United States on how to address these larger companies.
Very interesting, our discussion. There are a lot of details to every question that we have been worked on. I'm sure we'll have further opportunity, and I hope we'll have further opportunity to explore even deeper. Thank you so much for two of you joining us. William Li from the Milken Institute, Liu Baocheng from the Chinese University of Economics and International Business. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up in the program, the quick rollout of COVID vaccines underway. How safe and effective? Direct answers from the chief of the International Vaccine Institute.
There is a requirement that vaccines be safe and
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. As COVID-19 ripped through countries and filled up hospitals, a global effort was taken to eventually roll out vaccines for everyone. Shipments of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine to U.S. states began Monday morning, but people still have questions on the safety and efficacy of vaccines. So what are the standards? How many types of vaccines currently are there now? How they should be taken advantage of for the health of the most in the world? What are their differences? To answer all of these questions, I talked to Dr. Jeremy Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Let's listen to his answers. In Seoul, I'm joined by Jeremy Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Mr. Kim, what a pleasure to see you once again.
It's wonderful to see you also.
How are we going to verify the data provided by various pharmaceutical companies, as long as we know there are enormous amount of commercial interest involved?
So when a company is submitting documentation to a regulatory agency, like the NMPA in China or the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, it has to be very careful. So typically for trials like this, the company has not only looked at the data, but they've actually gone back to double check to make sure that particularly the infection data are correct. And there are ways, that companies can verify the accuracy of reports. And those kinds of things, we call them monitoring visits, are actually very important in ensuring that all research that's being done is being done according to the international standard of quality that regulates clinical trials, vaccine clinical trials in particular.
So far, China has been the earlier ones to work on the vaccine, but the data has not been made public either. Meanwhile, no final result has been made public, at least about the efficiency or efficacy and effectiveness of the vaccines. Tell me more about how do you see the issue?
So we're all waiting for Sinopharm, Sinovac to make their announcements. We know that they've submitted their packages to the regulatory authority in China, but again, we don't know. And it would be one of the things about doing science by press releases that to some extent people who study vaccines, who are very concerned about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, would very much like to see data as it's being announced. Now, It can be done several ways, but it helps to assure people that having had access and seen the data, that when we speak on television or to other reporters, that we're being accurate. And that's been a major problem with the rapid announcements that have been made recently.
On the other hand, some argue, well, this is an emergency anyway. I mean, it's an emergency for the world, and therefore we are going to give it, at least at the very beginning, the first responders and also the vulnerable groups. So why don't we, just use it as soon as possible? Why do we still have to, pondering about the data and thinking about the percentage? Let's just use them. What's your response?
My experience has been with the US FDA and Western regulatory authorities, and also now with the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea. And there is a requirement that vaccines be safe and effective. I think that different countries have different approaches, and that, for instance, Sinopharm and Sinovac both have approval for emergency use in China and actually in another country in the world. But this is in the absence of true efficacy data, and with some, but not a complete set, of safety data. And, for instance, the US FDA required at least 2 months on the average of safety on all the volunteers in a trial before it will issue emergency use authorization. Different countries have different views on the risks that a regulatory authority is taking if it doesn't look at all the data. And there have been occasions where vaccines have developed side effects that are rare, that weren't necessarily apparent even in the clinical trial that involved tens of thousands of people, but have turned up later. And an absence of regulatory review is one of those things that, at least I think for instance for the US FDA, that was not something that they were willing to do, because they consider this to be one of their key responsibilities.
What's going to happen with the next stage, both manufacturing, transporting, and also distribution, as well as vaccination, both within a country and beyond borders, on a global stage? We know this is the hardest question, but they have to be answered in a very efficient way from now on. What's your take?
Yeah, so you hit the two most important questions right on the head. Can we make enough of these vaccines? So maybe 16 billion doses. CEPI, which is a global organization, estimates that it will be 2023 to 2024 before we're able to make enough doses to vaccinate everyone in the world who needs to be vaccinated. And this vaccine can't just be any old vaccine. It should be a vaccine that meets international standards for quality. So that's a very important part. And then the other part is, none of these vaccines is going to have any impact on COVID until we use them in vaccination programs. And so not only do we have to make the vaccine, but we have to actually administer it, which means that you have to get it from, say, Sinopharm to a country where they're going to use it, and then from the airport at that country, out on a truck or a motorcycle to the places where the vaccine is going to be given. And this is an enormous logistical task. Now, there are some things that make it more difficult. For instance, with the new RNA vaccines, they have a requirement for storage at colder temperatures that may make it less practical to use these vaccines in low and middle income countries. It may be fine to use it in the United States or maybe in China or in Western Europe, but taking a vaccine that has to be stored at minus 70 degrees, which is the temperature of dry ice, could be a problem in many parts of the world.
Dr. Kim, another issue, we have quite a number of vaccines already available. Of course, later the use of vaccines will have to still wait for the regulators to give us the result. But how will these vaccines coexist and work in different populations? For example, there's some very practical matters. For example, one person traveled to one country. Does he or she needs to have the vaccination of one kind or another as being regulated by one country or another? And meanwhile, if one have already the vaccine, let's just say of a lower efficacy, but certainly work also, as regulators suggested in that country, and this person traveled to another country, could have access to another vaccine. Should he or she take it or not?
Those are great questions. And you know that in the month after efficacy was first announced, we still haven't come up with a good solution to them. Because you've hit on a key scientific question. we didn't rush, but we moved very quickly through vaccine development. So we didn't necessarily have time to optimize. We've also supported multiple vaccine candidates. That at any one time there could be 2, 3, 4 vaccines approved for use in a country. So what is the correct dosing interval? Do we have to give a booster dose? Big question. If you give a booster dose, can you give the same vaccine or should you give a different vaccine? So, it's been said that some of the RNA vaccines, the side effects get worse with subsequent doses. So if your symptoms or side effects are worse after the second dose, can you give a third dose? Or do you have to switch then to one of the other vaccines in order to get a maximal immune response? Should we vaccinate people who've already had an infection? So we know that some people who've had documented infections are becoming reinfected. So what are the criteria going to be? Is it dangerous if you've been infected to be vaccinated? All these scientific questions are really, really important to answer. The other practical question that you raised is, how do we document this? So within a country, if you're in the United States and happen to be in San Francisco and get the Pfizer vaccine, is it okay when you're in New York to take the Moderna vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine? We don't know. It probably is, but again, no one's actually really studied it because, the phase 3 trials are designed to answer one question. Does this vaccine protect against COVID-19 disease? It doesn't necessarily begin to answer the other questions that are going to have to be answered as a matter of practice, as multiple vaccines are out there. And then the final, I think, section is, how are these vaccines going to work in people who are old, over the age of 75? Or can we vaccinate pregnant women? Can we vaccinate women of childbearing age who intend to get pregnant? How safe is this, in other words? Can we vaccinate people with diseases that would decrease their immune response, such as people with HIV/AIDS who are on treatment or who are not being treated or suboptimally treated? All of these questions have to be answered. They weren't in the first set of questions, but they're going to be important as we vaccinate the 8 billion people who live on planet Earth. And, the important additional question has to do with one that you already raised, which is around real-world evidence. How is this vaccine going to work? How are these vaccines going to work? When we start to vaccinate entire populations and not just 30,000 people in a clinical trial where half get vaccine and half get placebo, and the study nurses and doctors follow people very, very closely to the very end of the trial. That's not going to happen when we're in the real world. So how do we do these things practically? And then finally, how does one country verify that another country's vaccination document is actually correct? Will the little yellow WHO immunization folder be sufficient? Or will there be some question raised about, can you forge signatures or forge vaccine signatures on a paper document? Those are all very important questions that countries will have to answer internally for their own purposes, and then internationally, as people from China want to travel to, the United States or to Europe. What kind of requirements are there going to be, and how do you verify them? Very, very important questions.
In certain countries, the awareness about vaccines, the trust toward the authorities and toward the medical community might not be as high in some of the other countries. And therefore, vaccines in some countries have to be optional. How should the rest of the world look at this situation and say, when we are all taking the vaccines, you guys are saying, well, it's optional. Then you will become the weak point, and therefore none of us will be safe. So why should we still have the vaccines anyway? Dr. Kim, how do you see this global governance issue involved very urgently, I would assume, about vaccines in front of all of us?
Consistent messaging from the top of the multilateral organizations, from the World Health Organization, from the United Nations, through the various economic groups like ASEAN and APEC, and through the G7 and the G20. The messaging from the top needs to be consistent. We also need to get out in front with the science. Unfortunately, we have a successful publication of a press release. We still haven't seen the data. And at the same time, the people who are opposed to vaccination are making stories and putting misinformation onto the internet and feeding misinformation to people all over the world. So when we have the information, we'll be much better armed. And we should plan now to have a very intense amount of communication around the safety and efficacy of the vaccines when the data are available. And nationally, within individual countries, leaders are going to have to work to make a very consistent, very strong message about the need for vaccination in order not to only to stabilize their countries, the society, the economy, but in also as well to begin normal activities with regard to other countries. Because you're absolutely right. No one wants to carry on trade or allow in people from a country that is not following the rules. And so I think we're going to need very strong advocacy. We're going to need unity among countries around the world about the need to implement COVID-19 vaccination, the need to provide vaccines equitably to countries around the world.
Wonderful point, as always. Dr. Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, what a pleasure. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching.